This week, Ryan Freed from Brooks Running is with us to discuss quantitative security planning. Then Tim Morris from Tanium joins us to talk about the lines between personal and work blurring, as well as good MFA and bad MFA. And finally, in the enterprise security news, Cloudflare has $1.25 billion incentives to draw customers away from AWS. NetSpy raises $410 million for pen testing. Tynes extends their Series B an extra $55 million. Detectify and Eclipsium also raise funding. There's some big funding for Web3 startups, adversary emulation tools for blue teamers, and breaking news, the security market isn't out of money. It's just fine. The art of selling security to cybersecurity people, all that on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Don't leave the door open. Secure your APIs with the Curity Identity Server. Curity allows you to centralize identity management policies with a solution developed by an expert team using well-established standards. Curity facilitates scalable security for apps and websites by offering a unique combination of identity and access management with API security. Protect your users, secure apps and websites, manage API access. Start your free trial today at securityweekly.com/curity. Companies big and small are using AwareGo's human risk assessment to measure the human risk factor in cybersecurity. This interactive solution allows companies to measure employees' knowledge and behavior across threat vectors such as phishing, passwords, sensitive data, and more. After completing the assessment, CISOs can identify vulnerable departments and roles and improve internal policies or procedures. Visit securityweekly.com/AwareGo to start your free trial. Customers want fast and frictionless digital experiences, yet also expect protection against breaches, privacy violations, and fraud. Drive engagement by optimizing security and convenience to attract and retain customers. Use the PingOne cloud platform to build, test, and optimize digital experiences. The no-code orchestration engine weaves together authentication, user management, and MFA, all of which can enhance security, drive engagement, and boost revenues. Visit securityweekly.com/ping-identity to learn more.
And welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly. And happy Noodle Day. This is really going to boggle your noodle. I am your host, Tyler Robinson, and this is episode 291, recorded on Thursday, October 6th. Joining me is Tyler Shields. How are you, other Tyler?
What? Noodle, bake your noodle. Reminds me of the scene in The Matrix when the Oracle says, "You just wait. That's really going to bake your noodle."
That's all I could think about.
Absolutely.
Also joining me today is Katie Tietler. How are you, Katie?
I'm well. I also enjoy noodles. Yes.
You enjoy noodles too.
Sure, why not?
Noodle Day means.
Maybe it means we noodle on what Noodle Day means.
I like that. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all the new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, our Discord server, which is very active, or follow us on any of the social media and streaming platforms. So for today's interview, today's topic is quantitative security planning from the front lines, and we're super excited to have Ryan Freed, Senior Security Engineer at Brooks Running, with us today. Ryan holds a master's in security, has worked in security for 9 years, and is working as an adjunct professor teaching security for the last 7 years. Ryan currently specializes in security automation, network segmentation, and purple teaming. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, happy to be here.
Excellent. You're a veteran to this show. You've been on the show 2 other times before, right?
Yeah, it's been great. It's been nice
Awesome.
to be able to talk from a practitioner point of view.
Yeah, we're really excited about this episode. Honestly, the whole strategic planning, road mapping is really one of those things that is near and dear to my heart, and one of the things that actually makes good security programs function. And then you're bringing in some qualitative analysis to this. So definitely excited about this episode.
Yeah, it's been great. I think, every year you work on your projects and you always have to think about what's next. And for companies that aren't subject to compliance like SOC 2 or PCI or HIPAA, it helps to have some kind of programmatic approach from the people who are actually doing the work of what's important and what you need to get better at.
So how did this kind of come about? What was some of the reasoning behind trying to build a quantitative analysis where you're looking at strategic roadmaps?
So this is actually the first company I've done an exercise like this. My manager developed it from some training, I believe, but in most of the jobs I've worked at, we have looked to map to NIST CSF or the CIS top controls. So I think this was a way that he started doing a couple of years ago, where we look at the CIS top controls that we map to, and we figure out how well are we doing at it, and then how important it is that we improve about it.
Do you think this kind of approach takes away some of the academia that is often? I mean, you're an adjunct professor. That is often one of the things that you were talking about before the show is the difference between academia and really the practitioner's viewpoint. Do you think by doing it this way, you start to call out some of the things that tend to be an issue by just saying, something like just patch all the things? That's great. What are some of the caveats to the frameworks and what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think it really shows that you can't be perfect at everything. Certain things, say like if you're a 3-person shop or a 5-person shop, you're probably not going to score a 10 out of 10 for forensics or incident response. So it takes all the different controls into account and thinks, how good do we need to be at these things? What are the really foundational controls? Like for us, asset management, because you can't secure what you don't know about. Vulnerability management and having processes around those are really important. Maybe a penetration test isn't as important. Maybe you can do internal control validation. So there's different ways to approach it. But you're right, it does combat some of the academia, like just disable PowerShell. No one uses it. Well, that's not exactly true. A lot of tools use that in the background, and there are legitimate purposes for it. So you do get some of those caveats that are more realistic.
I'd love to step back just a little bit too, and kind of talk about your day job and kind of where that roadmap has led and the progression of what Brooks Running has done, as well as some of the trials and where you guys have grown to. Being in the retail space, that offers a whole lot of interesting challenges that many other verticals don't have to contend with.
Yeah, I mean, being in the retail sector, ransomware is always in the back of our mind. We map a lot of the important controls around that. So making sure people have least privilege access, they don't have admin rights. A lot of workstations is super important as ransomware spreads. Another thing in what I've been involved with in the last year is network segmentation. Now in CIS top controls, or if you read about through Zero Trust, it might say segment all the things, including server to server traffic. But for anyone who's tried to do that, they know it's really, really hard to do that, especially with new applications coming in. So based on the CIS top controls, we took a look at what traffic is the easiest to segment, but also the most impactful. And with most ransomware starting from a phishing attempt, most likely on a workstation, we prioritized user to server network segmentation to make sure it doesn't spread to those on-premise or even cloud servers. So that's one way we took something as broad as network segmentation, but then, in reading through the news and in my day job, we thought that the best bang for our buck would be looking at user to server.
So I have a question, Ryan. You mentioned 3-person shops, or you mentioned smaller shops when it comes to cybersecurity. I know a lot of security folks that don't have a team, don't have a massive budget, are just starting to build their program. You mentioned asset visibility, you mentioned lateral movement, you mentioned all sorts of different approaches to cybersecurity or technologies you could apply into a cybersecurity program. Where do you start? What's the fundamental basis that you would want to start on if you were trying to build a program using your methodology?
Yeah, it's a great question. So NIST and CIS have done a really good job in the last couple of years breaking down their top controls into categories. What are the absolutely need to have foundational controls? And then you start to move into tier 2, tier 3 as you're starting to mature as a program. So even with those 18 controls, or however many there are for NIST cybersecurity framework, they actually do break down ones that every company should have. Things like multi-factor authentication, having some kind of antivirus on your machine, maybe EDR, but they do a really good job breaking that down based on the size of your company.
Now that's interesting that you bring up the ransomware side of this. Is that one of the major focuses of your guys' retail and kind of threat landscape? And how does that differ or kind of adapt based on the different verticals that you tend to see?
Absolutely. So I've come from the insurance verticals at a few different companies and a payment provider. So we thought about PCI and HIPAA. We were very heavily regulated. So that gave us the foundation of things that we were looking at. But, like I'm sure most security companies look at, you need to also look at the threat landscape. So for us, what we're most worried about is financially motivated threat actors and ransomware. Because if we had any of our main system taken offline or our distribution center or different things, that can have a huge impact. Where we don't have that sensitive data that an insurance company or a payment provider company might have. So we always think about what are the crown jewels, what would be the absolute worst case scenario that could happen. And as of now, that's ransomware. So our manager reports to the board about the key ransomware controls that he defined, where our progress is, what our roadmap is, and such, because those are the most important. And the board members, they read about ransomware in the news all the time. So it's something that's important to show we are thinking about it. And a lot of our efforts are driven towards that and mitigating the impact.
What are some of the things that you're doing for ransomware mitigation? Because so often we hear companies relying really, really heavily on the end user. And as we know, that's not 100%. That's never gonna stop anything 100%. Nor is it necessarily the end user's responsibility. So what are you doing? How are you combining your program? How are you trying to get as full coverage as you can?
I think the key priorities over the last few years and going forward have been the backup and recovery process, making sure that's really solid, that the backups are immutable, and that someone inside of our network couldn't compromise those backups. And then testing the backups to make sure they actually work. Having some kind of EDR that can handle a lot of the commodity malware or ransomware is helpful. That user to network, user to server segmentation is really important, so it can't spread necessarily. Because if we just need to wipe a workstation, that's not a big deal. But if it's spreading rampant to like our domain controllers or other key servers, that's a different story. And then the last one I'll talk about is the combination of asset inventory and vulnerability management. You can't secure what you don't know about. Can't tell you how many pen tests I've had where we were solid until they found one server that didn't have EDR on it, and they compromised that and they moved laterally. But then the servers we do know about, making sure they're up to date on patches and using vulnerability management to validate that. So those are the big ones we're working on.
So I have a follow-on question. You mentioned you can't secure what you don't know about, and I love that line. I love that tagline. My company uses that tagline specifically. What do you do as an organization to inventory and find everything? How do you track that?
Yeah, it could be a challenge because you think about workstations and servers can be tracked differently. There are definitely times where we'll export lists and look at the total number of devices in our XDR or EDR, and then compare that to, let's say, what our vulnerability management tool sees compared to what we have in VMware. So there are tools out there that are helpful with different API calls to consolidate a lot of that, but it's definitely challenging. With any asset inventory, you need to make sure your tools are properly configured, because if you have some type of scanning tool that looks into your internal network. Did you put a firewall rule to also scan the DMZ, which are your important assets, which can be potentially externally facing? So it can be a challenge, and it's trying to make it as automated as possible.
Yeah, I love that story. Kind of the automation and the integrations into what you have to be able to pull all those assets into a central repository makes a whole lot of sense. And I'm sure Katie's chomping at the bit over there thinking, hey, Tyler, my company does that too. And she's not wrong. So that's why I had those specific questions. T-Rob, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious how you go about prioritizing some of these strategic roadmaps. You guys don't really fall under HIPAA or PCI, or you don't have a ton of PII inside the environment. So your crown jewels, you've identified those, but how do you go about leveraging the CIS controls and prioritizing that based on the skills you have? I think some of the novelty of the way that you guys think about the priorities and the way that you're actually quantitatively looking at these to build your priorities is very important, and is one of the more unique ways I've actually seen someone think about it.
Yeah, so this is where the quantitative aspect comes. So you can look at the CIS controls. I think there's over 150 of them, so it might take an hour or two. But basically, each analyst or engineer will look at each specific subcontrol, and then on a scale of 1 to 10, they'll rank how good do you think we are at it, and how good do you think we need to be. So let's say for asset inventory, or how important it is. So let's say asset inventory, we think we're a 5, but we think it's the importance is a 9. You know, asset inventory is foundational to any security or IT program. So each analyst looks at each one. And then I think really the value of this exercise is the educational aspect to the whole team. So for instance, one of the subcontrols is to make sure you have command line auditing enabled for Windows Event Log. And I was responsible for the control. So I said, yep, we got it. We're 10. It's important, but we do it. But a couple other members of the team put a 0 because maybe they didn't know that we had that. So that generates a discussion saying, oh, I wasn't sure that we did that. That's helpful to know. Because obviously in a 5-person security team, I'm sure that scales out a bunch. You can't know everything that's getting done. So it's really helpful to get that holistic picture to see what we're doing as a whole program. So at the end of the scoring and such, our boss will look at the standard deviation, look for any outliers like I was just talking about, and then we'll discuss, well, we all think asset inventory is really important, and we only score, let's say, a 3. That's going to make the strategic priorities for next year, and then so on and so forth.
That helps you also identify not only skills gaps, but training and education gaps so that you have that ongoing and continual improvement. You're providing a great roadmap for the juniors to move up to senior roles, to get cross-training with inside of that, develop the different teams and meshing maybe training and skills availability that they didn't even know was on the team. I think all of those things help to build a redundant security team that is much more cohesive than just allowing a self-review at the end of the year and then maybe a performance review by your manager. That doesn't really help the team and ongoing, especially from the whole team's strategy for the business. I think bringing the team into that and helping identify those for priorities, that's what's making a big difference, obviously.
Yeah, and I can give you an example off of that. So one of them being around incident response and forensics. We had tier 1 capability in-house, but it's something that while we have a retainer for a company that can come in the event of a real incident, we identified that while we might score ourselves at a 5, how we currently are, that's something where our boss thinks we can get to a 7. And that ties to our training plan, where I can now easily justify some training class to improve my incident response or forensic skills. So you're right. It really does help identify cross-training and where we can improve our skills. And it's beneficial to our manager and the company because it helps mature our security program.
Now, do you guys bring in Oh, go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to ask about that prioritization because you hit on it, Tyler, and we sort of got there. But when you're talking about prioritization, yes, you can assess yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever your decision is. But how are those decisions being made? You talk about your team, but I assume there's also some more global business-wide discussion going on as well, because, like you said earlier, what's important to a retail company may not be the same thing for a telecom, for a financial services company. So how are those priorities decided based on business context?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So while we'd like to be this as quantitative as possible, there definitely is a qualitative aspect of it. So ultimately, it needs to feed up into Brooks' goals as a company and align with what our CTO thinks and other people in the IT program within Brooks. So our boss will have an idea, we'll talk through all those things, and then he'll talk with his peers and his boss what we're thinking about our goals are. But then this is the important part, what resources we need from other teams. Because as I'm sure all of you know, security isn't in a silo. A lot of the things that we need to do rely on other teams, either for consultation or to actually do the work. So while we want to do, maybe 10, 15, 20 things, if we rely on the engineering team or service desk team, we need to figure out what their availability is and how we can fit into their plans.
So what I hear you saying is that the security team needs to have communication, and we all need to be better about communicating between the different business and asset owners in order to get something done.
Absolutely. And I've spent more time than anything building relationships with people across teams like infrastructure and development and such, because if we need to look at like patching, we're not doing the patching, at least my team is not. We need to work with their team and have them understand that it's a joint goal. If the goal was just ours to get, all of our Sev 5 vulnerabilities patched, that's great, but that needs to be a goal of the infrastructure team or whoever does the patching as well, to give them some accountability, but then also give them the credit because they're doing a lot of that work.
Have you seen that the ease of which you're able to get things accomplished and the initiatives that security is pushing, have you seen that adjust and change based on the relationships you've been building? And as those relationships begin to solidify and you actually have buy-in from the other departments, do you see that helps? And that's something that you guys can actually measure?
100%. This is probably my favorite thing to talk about because your relationships inside of your team are really important, but the relationships across other IT teams or your business partners are just as important, if not more important. Realistically, the technical aspect is usually pretty easy, but you need to get them to understand this is why we need to do something. And in a previous show, I talked about control validation. Now I can actually show them if this isn't patched, this is what I can do. So having them have that joint accountability where it's on their roadmap and their salary and bonus and everything are tied to it just like ours is great. But it's also really important to have that relationship with them and build that trust. And I found, one of the best things that I can do is anytime they ask anything of us, to do it as quickly as possible, obviously making sure it's all correct. But I want to show them it's a two-way street. We just can't ask them for everything. We try to jump on things that would help them as well.
How do you get to that place, right? So it sounds like your company has really good collaboration. Security is baked into other processes and other business departments are bought in to security, but far too often that's not the case. So how would you recommend it if you were consulting with, or if you went to a completely new company where they see security as security's problem and you need that help and business collaboration?
Yeah, I've seen a real shift from security where, years ago when I first started, we were the bad guys, where we would say, you can't do this, you can't do that. Where I see us more as being able to enable, like everyone wants to do their job securely, But I found some of the easiest ways. It's more of a challenge in the remote environment. When I was in the office, it was way easier and you can grab lunch with them and such. But I just like to learn what they do. A lot of people want to talk about what they do and they're pretty prideful. So I would set up meetings and talk with my peers on other teams just to figure out what do they care about? What are their goals? How did it happen like before I was there? But really just nerding out with them and figuring out what makes them tick.
Yeah, really, really sitting down with them. A free sandwich doesn't hurt either, but actually showing interest in them so that they'll also be interested in what you do, and then create that relationship.
And I think it's critical to come at why something needs to be done. If I tell someone they need to enable command line auditing or PowerShell transcript logging or do all these things, I like to provide context to it. This is why we do it. This is how it helped us. This is the threat that's coming against it. And doing as much due diligence as possible. For instance, like we've seen, I think the VMware vulnerabilities out recently. One of the worst things you can do is just throw it over to the wall of them and say, here, figure it out. But if I can tell them this is remote code execution and it's being exploited in the wild and all these things, and we're actually on that vulnerable version, which not everyone always does, that builds trust. I did a lot of work. So when I tell them about something, it's probably true. Where I find some people just throw vulnerabilities to them, have no idea if we use that software, no idea what version we're on, and don't put any risk context with it. That just doesn't work.
Right, that's the FUD. That's the FUD approach versus, hey, this affects us, here's why. But I assume you're tempering your conversation. If you're working with IT, it's one thing to talk to them about PowerShell. If you're talking to finance, completely different ballgame.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's our boss's job to talk to more of the executive leadership team. I think we do a really, really good job at Brooks partnering with the different IT and business functions. So they actually have a go-to person when something happens. So if there's a vulnerability or something for a SaaS platform that we use or some application they use, there's no question who to go to. They have their security person and it all funnels through there. So I feel like having someone, even if they just attend a meeting once a month on that IT or business team, is huge. So they don't second guess who they should go to and then maybe they forget to even mention it.
That's awesome. No, this is really a refreshing view, and honestly seeing and hearing how passionate you are and the levels at which Brooks is taking this and getting the buy-in from both the executives and a top-down and bottom-up approach. I think this really speaks to this actually working, getting the relationship, identifying the whys, getting business buy-in and building those relationships for long-term strategy for the whole company and the betterment of the company is really the way to do it.
Yeah, it's been an awesome thing to see Brooks mature even over the last year and even before my time over the last few years. But just having those relationships, getting people to understand the importance of security and having them be our front line has proven really successful for us.
That's awesome. Well, Ryan, is there anything that you'd like to leave with our listeners, a final word, final thought? Additionally, anything you want to plug or recommend for our users to go check out about you?
Yeah, so the final plug. So in the show notes, there should be a link to the CIS Controls. It's not going to be perfect the first time. I think just looking at strategically, what are the biggest threats against you? What do you care about the most? Can't secure everything, but if you can make the really important things, the foundational things, rock solid, you're doing a good thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Ryan.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you having me.
And stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to discuss this year's Cybersecurity Awareness Month theme with Tim Morris from Tanium.